The more women work, naturally the more the family will earn. And therefore societies with high gender ratios, high female participation, or parts of India with high female participation naturally do better because those families earn more money. And as you'd expect, Southern India has far higher labor force participation from women than the North does, right? This has happened for the first time in India in the last 12 months. In urban and metropolitan areas, RBI data is showing that women have more money in their bank accounts than men. RBI data is also showing that women have more bank accounts than men. So women have more accounts and the accounts have more money, right? Peninsular India, I am referring to Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, right? We are also including Goa in Peninsular India. We know that the Peninsular India states account for roughly a third of the population. Right? Secondly, we know that they account for half the GDP, right? And therefore half the tax collection comes from these states. Why Peninsular India is pulling away so fast from the rest of the country? $3 trillion question. The fastest growing region in the world today is not East Asia. The fastest growing region in the world today is Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka, parts of Maharashtra and parts of Gujarat.
Hi Saurabh, Nandita, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. So for everyone, very quickly, so Saurabh, I'll just tell you something first. So at one of the CFA India events in Kolkata, so when you were doing the tour for your book Unusual Billionaires, so that's the time I had met you first at a session, and it's been fabulous. I've been recommending Unusual for CFA Level 1 students while they're studying equity, and for FRM Level 1 students as well to understand how Axis Bank and HDFC Bank happened. So very quickly, so Saurabh is a postgraduate in economics from LSE and fellow CFA charter holder and heading Marcellus Investments.
Nandita is a postgraduate diploma in economics.
And she's also heading towards her CFA Level 3 exam, so all the very, very best for it.
Thank you.
And let me know if there's any problem. I was just telling her that before the session started. So let's jump right into the questions.
Thank you for doing this.
Most welcome. I want to touch upon more of macroeconomics today and have a very candid understanding, because a lot of misconceptions are there when we're looking at the markets and how we are evaluating the market, some of which we were just discussing a while back. So when we're looking at the macroeconomic aspects and all, what are the indicators, for example, you would feel that is very, very important when you're looking at valuations or fundamental analysis? Your first set of ratios, tools, etc. that you look at in terms of evaluating the health of the economy, if they're not relevant at all, and it's just that we're going after them.
So look, I mean, we'll break this into three parts, right? I always believe that there's three sets of metrics one should understand. First part would be social indicators. Second is corporate indicators, company level indicators. And the third are macroeconomic level indicators, right? And I'll request Nandita to discuss the macro level indicators, right? But let's start with what I think are the most critical indicators to focus on when you try to understand a country and economy, right? And we've discussed this in more detail in our forthcoming book, Behold a Leviathan, the unusual rise of modern India. When you look at a country, right, the way to understand society is broadly 3 or 4 things which I've always found to be very useful. Firstly, look at gender ratios. So if you're at an airport or at a railway station, or say if you're in the entry-level reception area of our office building, look at gender ratios, they're very revealing. So for example, if you look at gender ratios in Bangalore, in an office area, Bangalore or a Bangalore airport, it's very different from what it is in an office area in Northern India.
Okay.
Similarly, if you were to compare gender ratios in, say, London with gender ratios in an office area in Mumbai, it'll be different again, right? So first, and it's a very visual thing. Once you get your mind trained to keep looking for gender ratios, it tells you a lot about a society. At very simple level, the more women work, naturally, the more the family will earn.
Absolutely.
And therefore, societies with high gender ratios, high female participation, or parts of India with high female participation, naturally do better because those families earn more money. And as you would expect, Southern India has far higher labor force participation from women than the North does, right? Then the second thing to look for is body language. So both amongst men and women, look at body language. It tells you a lot, right? And especially now that I'm 2 years away from hitting 50, I've been looking at body language in many different countries for the last 30 years, and especially body language of young people, because at the level of confidence in an economy, level of confidence in a society, right? And there are plenty of books on how to read body language.
Robert Greene, I think, is...
That's right. There are plenty of books on how to read body language, but I think it's an essential skill If you want to be an investor, it'll help you when you meet company management teams, but even leaving that aside, right? How are people behaving when they're in public spaces? One of the reasons I ended up migrating to India 17 years ago was I used to run a small business in the UK. A small
capital.
That's right, yeah. We had a small office in Powai. I think this was 2005 or 6, right?
Okay.
And I was walking home from our office to the local hotel where I used to stay. And it was 9 or 10 at night, right?
Okay.
And I was walking past the bus stop. This is in the suburbs of Mumbai, 10 o'clock at night, right? And I saw a young lady going home from work. She had headphones on and she was sitting with one leg propped on the railing of the bus stop and the other hand like this, right?
Okay.
And it was a picture of supreme confidence from someone who's going to go home in public transport and feeling confident enough to have body language like that and listening to music, suggesting that a high level of security, right? And that's when I said that this country, and especially Maharashtra, will go places, because if you can engender that sense of confidence amongst people, it's a very powerful driver. So gender ratios, confidence, and the final aspect of, final straightforward aspect of social changes, asking people what are their aspirations for their children, right? So when you meet a business family or an entrepreneur or a listed company CEO, ask them, what do you aspire for your children? Because in people's aspirations lie a lot of messaging about how they see the future, right? Their sense of confidence. People can give you nonsense about and BS about their business, but very difficult for people to give you BS about their kids, right? So that's the first aspect, right? Understand society, understand social change, because it will tell you perhaps the most revealing sort of indicators about a country's future or that community's future. The second is the sort of thing that CFA candidates like Nandita specialize in, and CFA charter holders like me learned when I was in my 20s, which is, how do you read a company's balance sheet, specifically free cash flows, return on capital employed. They're very revealing, especially if you look at ROCs for a company or a sector over a decade. If ROCs are going significantly north of cost of capital, you know that sector or that company is creating value. And if ROC at the economy level, so if you compare India and China's ROCs, are very revealing. China's ROC never ever goes above cost of capital, and India's return on capital as a market almost always is above cost of capital, right? And that tells you that China as an economy rarely creates value, right? And this is true even 10 years ago, by the way. It's not a new development. China as an economy rarely creates value add, whereas India as an economy, even when our growth rates are low, India as an economy creates significant value add, right? And if an economy, just like a company, if an economy doesn't generate value add, then very difficult for the economy to invest in its future. It's basically borrowing money to run the show, and that's not a sustainable game. The third set of metrics would be around the economy itself, and I'd request Nandita to chime in here.
Right. So I would just like to break this myth that GDP is the best metric that you can get. GDP is not the best metric that you can understand if you want to understand the economy. What I found really useful in my course of work and trying to write this book as well as do my day job is that you go and travel, you meet people like Saurabh said, you sort of validate whatever concept you've had. You must have had some concept, that's why you're asking a few questions. You validate that
on-ground hypothesis validation.
Correct. You do that, and then finally whatever changes that Saurabh spoke about, that reflects later on in the macro numbers. It's not the macro numbers driving this change. The change is driving.
It's a lagging indicator.
Exactly. So it's the other way of causation that goes around. So if you want to understand the country, you can't just look at the GDP numbers, can't look at investment capex. That's a result of what is happening. The broader point is to understand the how. The broader point is to understand why, the drivers of the change. And which is exactly what we've also tried to do.
And just to supplement what Nandita is saying, right, more revealing than GDP. If someone has a liking for macro data, then more revealing than GDP are the more granular data indicators, such as, say, freight movement, right? Such as electricity consumption.
Number of cars.
Your cars, credit offtake, car sales, credit offtake typically tend to be. So if you look at electricity consumption, freight movement, credit offtake, growth in highway network, growth in telecom usage, growth in airline traffic, those sorts of more granular macro indicators tend to give you more useful data than whatever that quarter's GDP print is. So first problem, as you rightly said, is it's lagging indicator. वो तो हो चुका है.
Correct.
It's giving you the rear view mirror picture of the economy, but it is such an aggregated indicator with so many data inefficiencies that it's an inefficient way to understand the country. Thankfully, we are a data-rich country, and tons of data comes out every month. Courtesy the way GST is collected, you get GST collection data now every month, right? That's a pretty powerful indicator of if you want to understand an economy. One indicator, say you're a lazy person, आपको इतना सारा data देखना नहीं है. If you're a lazy person, then just look at the tax collection data. The GST data comes out every month. The direct tax data comes out once a quarter.
Right. So if someone is looking at evaluating and analyzing macroeconomic data, so one from experience and observation that you pick up over time. So what are the sources and anything apart from the government sources of data that you look at?
So we use this CMI data both on project announcements as a source of CapEx. CMI publishes, I think, it's probably the most credible non-government data on projects and CapEx, right? The other source of non-government data we find useful is the auto industry data. There's both the distributor trade body and then there is the auto OEM ka trade body. FADA, I think FADA, and then CM is the auto OEMs ka trade body. Then there's a whole bunch of data that you can get on exports by company, by sector. I think this comes from the customs and excise people. It's sort of quasi-governmental data because it's sort of companies saying, we've exported itna cars to Egypt this month and so on. And the last stream would be CMI again, collates data on 30,000 companies, profits across, every year going back decades, right? Now, the only challenge there is the survivorship bias in that.
Yes.
But if you're willing to deal with the survivorship bias, that's the most consistent data you can get on broad corporate profitability, 30,000 companies. They're not the largest 30,000, but these are 30,000 companies which are generating a profit existing today and going back 15, 20 years.
Right. Any macroeconomic data, Western macroeconomic data, global macroeconomic data out of India that you look at? And
what I found useful during my analysis, and I often keep saying this, if you're looking at social indicators, the point is to look at the direction of change, not the level. The level may not be the most appropriate and there might be debates about it, but the direction is what you should look at. And for that purpose, I think IMF publishes really good data. World Bank also has a good data repository. The only issue with that is it will not get updated with the latest data. So the last data point I think is 2022 as far as I know. So that's the only concern with it. But if you want to look at the directional change.
On that actually, educational attainment data, right? So there's a not-for-profit called Pratham. They publish educational attainment data at a very granular level. Different parts of India, different age categories. And then there's a government department.
Yes, so ISHE is All India Higher Secondary Education data is for the 11th and 12th standard for the high school.
So again, if you can see girls' participation in the education system versus boys, and in India today, at every level of the education system, in Behold a Leviathan, we have highlighted that in every level of the education system, there are more girls studying than boys. And the pass rates for the girls are much higher than boys. Now
I see that in my classroom as well.
Now, unfortunately, due to lack of space in the book, we couldn't give the state-by-state metrics, but those are available and they're incredibly interesting to see. In which states are the women pulling away the fastest from men? And, if anybody watching this wants to wager, I'm happy to take them on. States where women are pulling away fastest from men on educational attainment are the states that will grow the fastest in India in the years to come.
So I have a 75% female workforce in my team, but it did not happen with any conscious effort. It's just that whoever wanted to do and whether they're good, they're fitting and they're doing good, it just goes on beyond.
And this is a very powerful theme. If you look at, say, RBI data, RBI data is now showing that this has happened for the first time in India in the last 12 months. In urban and metropolitan areas, RBI data is showing that women have more money in their bank accounts than men.
14%.
Right?
That's the number.
40%.
Right? So right? And further, RBI data is also showing that women have more bank accounts than men. So women have more accounts and the accounts have more money. Right? Right? And if you then link it to again RBI data, which shows that delinquency rates for women are half that of men. Right? So we would submit to you that these sorts of indicators are far more useful for investors than knowing is quarter's GDP growth number.
Got it. Any particular external indicator, as an external to India, that impacts India per se?
See, the main metric that has a bearing on our lives as investors is the US 10-year bond yield, right? That's the spine for the global financial system. That's the world's risk-free rate.
Right.
Typically, when the US 10-year bond yield is going up, the rupee comes under pressure, foreigners pull out of the Indian market, and vice versa.
Right.
To be honest, beyond the US 10-year bond yield, we don't spend a lot of time looking at Western metrics. Naturally, given what's happening in China and the kind of implosion of the Chinese economy, given the amount of dumping that the Chinese do on the Indian economy, we keep an eye on what's happening in China. But by and large, I would say 70-80% of the relevant global indicators from us are captured by the US 10-year bond yield.
Perfect. So we've talked about, let's say, for example, the states wherein the gender ratio or the women participation is going up. The states are doing very, very well. So my question is that are we looking at a particular trend wherein the southern part of India is doing favorably as compared to the rest of India, or they're growing at a better rate, or their participation is better in any way?
So let's just discuss what pulling together various data sources are saying, right? First off, what we know from population data is that peninsular India, by peninsular India, I'm referring to Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, right? We're also including Goa in peninsular India. Right. We know that the peninsular India states account for roughly a third of the population, right? Secondly, we know that they account for half the GDP, right? And therefore, half the tax collection comes from these states. And thirdly, looking at the state level GDP data, they call it GSDP, we know that roughly 2/3 of India's GDP growth is coming from peninsular India. So 1/3 of the population, half the GDP, and roughly 2/3 of the growth, right? Now, why peninsular India is pulling away so fast from the rest of the country is I think a $3 trillion question. We have attempted to answer it in Behold the Leviathan in our book. We've attempted to answer it, but I think both of us will be humble enough to say that it's probably the defining question that India has to answer. Why is the South, and specifically peninsular India, including Maharashtra, why are these states pulling away so fast from the rest of the nation? We've attempted an answer, but I don't think we will pretend that we've got the full answer. This obviously has enormous economic significance. It has enormous significance for investors. At a very simple level, if you invest in companies that have over-indexed on peninsular India, if you invest in companies that have doubled down on peninsular India, we think you stand to make way more money than if you invest in companies that are over-indexed on, say, the north and the east, right? So it's one of the defining questions for the country as to why this has happened. But the fastest growing region in the world today is not East Asia. The fastest growing region in the world today is Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka, parts of Maharashtra and parts of Gujarat, right?
For example, someone from outside the country comes to a country like India and just visits the southern India. Or there's just no problem here. Because it's so prosperous.
So again, linking back to social indicators, right? One of the simplest ways to understand any country is talk to taxi drivers, right?
Nowadays, the Uber guys get very irritated when you talk politics with them.
No, so shouldn't. I mean, I think that's provocative to discuss politics with them. At least I don't have the courage to broach the topic right. So I wait till the last 5 minutes of the taxi ride before I touch the electric wire. Right. So you begin by asking, how is business, right? But the more revealing thing I've found is when we travel to, say, Coimbatore, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Vijayawada, right? The taxi driver, the discourse you have with him, to be honest, is as refined as the discourse that we might believe we are having here, right? Obviously, it's a very different ball game in North India altogether. If you also look at not just the discussion of the taxi driver, his clothes, the watch on his hand, the phone in his hand, right? It'll be in a different ballpark. And I think that's when Nandita makes a fair point. If you were a foreign investor visiting Vijayawada versus a foreign investor visiting Ghaziabad, you would go home with a very different perception of where you would like to invest your money.
Interesting. So you also mentioned about when you're talking about the external indicators and about the impact that China has given the dumping and the policies and all. So we are also looking at a lot of manufacturing incentives in India with the PLI schemes and all. And of course, there's a race or a major discussion around how the currency is faring and what everybody is doing, stock market, etc. So how do we look at China and also in relation to the manufacturing incentives given in India? So somewhere around the manufacturing, so are we looking at the data? Again, not exactly asking for the trends, but I'm asking about how do you look at the data regards to manufacturing?
So look, I think you raised perhaps the most relevant policy question that the new government faces in Delhi at this juncture. It is clear China is dumping manufactured goods across the world, right? But leaving aside China's dumping, it's also clear that we have a competitiveness challenge in manufacturing. That is three broad reasons why for decades, I think long as people watching this program were born, we have a competitiveness challenge. Three reasons. Firstly, labor in India is unusually expensive for what is the 140th poorest country in the world. We're one of the poorest countries in the world, and we have unusually expensive labor. So just to put things in context, the state, Nandita and I live in Maharashtra. The minimum wages in Maharashtra are 3 times that of Bangladesh.
Okay.
Bangladesh and India per capita income is the same. But Maharashtra minimum wages are 3x that of Bangladesh, right? And therefore, say a shirt like this, do you really want to make this shirt in India, or would you rather make it in Bangladesh, given that there is no great science to making this shirt, right? And unsurprisingly, therefore, increasing numbers of Indian apparel manufacturers choose to get the apparel by and large made in Bangladesh. They put the finishing touches, they say the strip on the shirt in India, right? Second thing is industrial land in India is expensive and very hard to get, right? And the jhanjat, the time taken, the hassle in getting the land is bad enough. And after you've dealt with the jhanjat, you're still paying a steep price for it.
Right? And at times they can throw you over even if you got the land.
Right. There's a whole, So some of our investee companies, right? Some of our investee companies who've been operating in Western India for decades struggle to get land. And EPS growth, corporate profits are flatlining there, not because there's any lack of demand, but because they can't get the land to expand the factory. Right? So this is the second issue. And thirdly, cost of working capital is 4x, 5x higher in India compared to China and Southeast Asia, right? So a good company in India, profitable, well-run company, will still pay 9, 10, 11% for working capital from a good private sector bank. The same company, were it operating in China, would access working capital at 2, 3, 4%. Right? So when you put these three things together, it becomes almost close to impossible for Indian manufacturers to compete on the world stage, right? All of that being said, the situation has improved in the last decade, courtesy massive improvements in infrastructure. So in the book, we describe how the fact that the road network has almost tripled in the last 20 years has resulted in working capital cycle shrinking. The situation has also improved because the rise of Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, rise of GST has reduced tax evasion and put more companies in the white economy, in the formal economy, which has allowed them to tap formal sources of credit rather than borrowing from the money lender at 20, 21, 22%. Right? And the third reason the situation has improved is general level of quality of ports and railway freight has also improved. Right? So competitiveness has improved, and we've got to a point where we're within 5 to 10% of China's price points. Right? It doesn't. Some people might say 5 to 10% is not too far away, but it makes a world of difference. Remember, in most manufactured products, your PBT margins will be 5 to 10%. Basically, if you want to compete with China, you have to pretty much give up your entire profit margin. Right? So it's in that context, I think the PLI scheme is a good intervention. In the book, we explained why it's worked so well in mobile phones. Right? I think it's been a runaway success in mobile phones. As I'm sure your viewers know, Apple now makes $20 billion worth of phones in India out of the 200 billion of global production. And our reckoning is Apple will more than double its production of iPhones in India over the next couple of years. More work needs to be done to get PLI revved up and going in medical devices, in pharmaceuticals, and in the broader manufacturing ecosystem. But Nandita and my discussions with government officials suggest that they've used phones as a kind of prototype, And given that PLI works in phones, it looks likely it'll be ramped up across other sectors.
But also I believe wherein, of course, we understand that we are still on the relatively expensive side as compared to China in terms of the cost of production and everything. But at the same time, from what I'm seeing is that countries, because of the China Plus One policy, they're actually okay compromising a few hundred basis, not few hundred, maybe a couple of hundred basis points in terms of having that diversification in terms of the production venue. And since you mentioned about mobile phones and that being a prototype, so we've also been reading a little bit about how the hardware aspect of IT in terms of manufacturing has not gained that kind of pace, and they've not got that kind of incentivization from the government in terms of manufacturing. But I think there's now again a little bit of conversation that's happening around there, because our focus has always been more on the IT services side of things. So anything particularly, if I'm looking at, let's say, the IT space and the manufacturing of electronics space.
You've actually hit the key point here. The broader point from what Saurabh was speaking about the PLI scheme working in phones is that we as a country have a natural competitive advantage in something that is knowledge driven, manufacturing that is knowledge driven, light manufacturing. We can't do the heavy duty, labor intensive, crazy, China manufacturing model. It's naturally not possible for us for the reasons that Saurabh enumerated. But the broader point is that we can do capital intensive stuff.
Right.
I mean, it might seem a little counterintuitive for a country
so
of 1.4.
What technical kind of production aspects are we looking at?
So I think the semiconductor industry is seeing with the early stages of it, and I think credit should go to the folks in Delhi for realizing that there is a national security imperative as well. If you are perpetually dependent on China for semiconductors, remember the cutting edge semiconductors come from TSMC in Taiwan. So the iPhone that you're using, that semiconductor comes from TSMC in Taiwan. That's not a source of stress, provided Taiwan stays independent. We should be good on the cutting edge semiconductors, right? But the more prosaic semiconductors which go into the cars, into washing machines, into day-to-day electrical equipment, say the security apparatus outside our office building, right? Those chips come from China, right? 30 nanometer and so on. Now, that's not really cutting edge technology.
Right.
That's where India is saying we need to bring this to India, because in the event of hostilities escalating between China and the West, or indeed between India and China, the core industrial semiconductors which go into washing machines and cars the supply of that could get stopped. And that's where the government's PLI incentives and beyond PLI, other incentives from state governments are kicking in. And we are seeing the beginnings of a semiconductor industry arising in Gujarat. Fingers crossed that these companies will go on to make a profit 4 or 5 years out, because remember, government incentives can't last ad infinitum, right? So fingers crossed that these companies will go on to make a profit, because if they can make a profit, then that will lead to more companies saying, we also want to put in a 10 billion, 5 billion, 2 billion and get these more run-of-the-mill semiconductors made. I'm not so sure India is at a stage where either we can afford or indeed technically we can pull off the cutting edge stuff. That's a more edge business case. The core business case of making prosaic, ordinary semiconductors for basic industrial equipment. We need to get on with it. And I think the first steps, Micron, CG Power, they seem to have announced the first steps. Fingers crossed this goes on to succeed and become profitable ventures. So from a profitability perspective, our India's banks and India's IT services companies will benefit from AI. But from a jobs perspective, especially for the kind of workers that the class of workers that we belong to, this looks to be a real challenge